Everyday Inclusion and Belonging, where we talk about literally everything under the sun as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, best practices, things that are working, things that are not working. I am so excited for this conversation with Joe Santana, who is the chairman of the CDO Power Circle, because literally every time Joe and I get on a call, we usually have, about a half an hour booked or 45 minutes booked. And then usually at 45 minutes or an hour, we're saying, we got to go. We got to go. Because he is as passionate about creating a diverse and inclusive workplace and world as we are at Moxie. So Joe, and you've been doing this work a long time. When I think about somebody that has woven this in and committed as a leader and as a person to diversity, equity, and inclusion, Joe, thank you for modeling the way for all of us. And introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mo. So I'm Joe Santana. I'm the chairman of the CDO Power Circle and the creator and host of a podcast called ERG Power Talk. And basically, as the chairman of the Power Circle, what I do is I set and I drive a development agenda for leaders inside the DEI space. And my focus intentionally is the future. It's not looking so much at what are the best practices of the past or what are some incremental changes, but rather what are some of the signals of what's happening and how do we prepare for those? Because the future is not coming at us incrementally. It's coming at us exponentially. It's coming at us as a result of a confluence of different forces, including technologies. And so preparing for the future by looking back at what people did in the past doesn't work anymore. Now we have to look forward and actually anticipate what's coming and begin to prepare our organization and ourselves to be ready for those new events that are coming at us every single day.
Well, it's interesting, Joe. I often think to myself, I wish I could sort of teleport myself, 75 years from now, 100 years from now, and be able to look back at how we're talking about this time. Because I feel like we are this technological revolution and workplace revolution, everything that's been happening, it's actually mind-blowing, right? If you just look at the technology. So then what we need to be doing as leaders and organizations, there is no blueprint, right? You can't go back. We are literally creating in the moment. And I love your future focused about kind of what's next and what's on the edge of things, because I think when we're looking to the edge, that's when we're creating the new paradigms and the new models. And I think that's, this is a really great time to be doing diversity, equity, inclusion work and employee resource group, business resource group, however your organization calls them. Really interesting, compelling time to be doing this work. Why do you, I know why I think it's a great time. I'm curious why you think it's a great time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've always said that in musical chairs, your opportunity for getting a nicer chair is when the music starts. And the music in this case is disruption. All the disruption that's been going on, that started with the pandemic and then later on social unrest, which literally all it did was it just surfaced a lot of unresolved issues that have been around for quite a while now. And the other thing that it did was it forced organizations and people within them to begin to make use of technologies and to start thinking differently about how they connected with each other and how they work with each other, simply because they lost the means for doing it the way they used to do it. Literally, this was the boats are on fire, and now we need to jump into the cold ocean and swim over to the raft or to another vessel moment. So in this particular case, the opportunities that this presents for DEI and ERGs in particular is that there are a lot of gaps that have been exposed in terms of the way we're set up, over dependency on having people in one place, and the workforce and the workplace they're changing so dramatically. Like, for example, right now, in terms of just employees in the workplace, they only basically represent about 60% 40% of our workforce today is made up of non-employees, and that number is growing. A lot of models in HR and organizations and DEI are built around bringing in employees, engaging employees, but are those enough as this workforce sort of changes and becomes a workforce that's made up of 50% people who are not employees, 50% people that are? The other is actually the change in terms of the dimensions of the workplace. So the workplace has always had multiple dimensions, but we haven't given that much thought, because for the most part, up until the pandemic, most people reported to work at a work site or at a work building that belonged to the corporation. And they might have dabbled occasionally in using some of the other technologies, but it was a small percent. Only 6% prior to the pandemic actually worked remotely using things like Zoom, Teams, and so forth. That number jumped to 35% when the pandemic hit. And when it dropped, after the vaccines, it only dropped to about 24%, primarily because a lot of people don't want to go back to the old way of working. The other thing is that a lot of organizations today talk about preparing for a hybrid workplace, which is a workplace where you have some people in the office and some people who are coming in through technologies like Zoom or Teams or other technologies like this. That's actually not enough, because where people are actually moving to is into 4 different dimensions. And those 4 dimensions are the old same time, same place, which is where 94% of the workforce used to be. The new one has more people in it than ever before, which is the same time but different place. That's your Teams, your Zoom, and so forth. The other one is same place but at different times, and that used to be called shift work, but that's increasing now because people have to keep a certain amount of a limit on the capacity of people they have in the building, and so
I would say
that's increased.
Well, and I would say and increased globalization, right? So even just time zones of
Absolutely. And that's going to increase even more so with more technologies that we might talk about a little later. But in addition to that, then you have a 4th dimension, which is a different time and a different place. And that's the growth in things like email, using more say Google Docs in order to work on a project together. So someone comes in, does a little bit of work on it, the other person comes in later on. And there are companies, a new company out there called Loom, that's actually banking on that particular dimension growing. And they've developed a piece of software which they call the video version of email for the internet for the different time, different place worker. They've already got millions of subscribers. They've got venture capitalists that are pouring money into them. So clearly the investment community believes that that dimension is going to take off. So you've got people working in different dimensions, and organizations have processes that are designed primarily to develop and sustain a culture of people who are in one place. And in the past, they just ignored the other dimensions. But as more people pour into those dimensions, they can't ignore them anymore, because otherwise you're only serving a small piece of your workforce. And then, of course, we all have heard Mark Zuckerberg's announcements that made the metaverse a new word that's very common now in our vocabulary. That's something that's been around for a while, but now is going to be taking off, which is a place where literally you can go in there with a pair of VR goggles, virtual reality goggles, and some gloves, and you can step into a virtual world where you can interact with other people near and far, and you can work in that space as well. And that 5th dimension can actually connect the other 4, because you can be same time, same place, or same time, different place, even working in different times in different places, and all connect together in the metaverse. And ERGs and DEI practices are providing the life raft or the glue. And that word life raft I got out of an interview that I did with Kathy Jacobson, who's the CEO of Freighted Health in Wisconsin. And she was talking about how ERGs have become such an important component of creating and sustaining a culture, because you'll have a person who was hired now to work as a virtual worker in one of those other dimensions somewhere away from Wisconsin. And, instead of just having a connection back to their supervisor or to their immediate team because they belong to, let's say, the women's ERG, they have a connection to other people in the organization and other activities. And that creates more of a sense of belonging, sense of being part of the group beyond just being someone who works on a particular team. And there are some ERGs that have really, been able to pull their entire workforce together, especially during the pandemic. I know Dollar General as well as Freighter did an excellent job of using these technologies to create that cultural life raft that Kathy and I were talking about, that helps to sustain a sense of belonging to something, not just that you're connecting with a supervisor just to do, a transactional piece of work. So great opportunity for ERGs and DEI in that particular space. And there's even more. That's just one example.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's another, so layered on top of this dimension, I think one of the things that the pandemic also really highlighted is that most people are deskless, right? When we think about, and when we think about, talk about not wanting to look at the playbook of the past, so many DEI programs, approaches, strategies were for those white collar, corporate, desk job, right? And this was like, hey, guess what? That essential workers and folks that are out and about, they make up actually most employees, right? And so when you're thinking about these dimensions, it's also how are you designing for these 4 dimensions, but also for most of your employees who happen to not be tethered to a place, right? And so I think that that opportunity, and I've seen some interesting things. Lockheed Martin was doing really cool things with their ERGs across this, and it really is. By the way, this is a public service announcement for any organization that has ERGs, BRGs. Pay your leaders and make sure that they are embedded in your succession process. They are
Yes.
absolutely critical to engaging, being the voice of, being the connection to these groups, and value that. So that was my public service announcement, Joe.
Yeah. And, and it's a timely one because, quite frankly, one of the people that I interviewed for the podcast who did a survey on organizations that are paying their ERG leads pointed out that pre-pandemic, it was a small number, like 6%. Post-pandemic, it grew to 28%. And I can tell you from my own research and conversations with people that a lot of organizations are now exploring, like, how do we do this? Because they're realizing that this is not just a nice to have. They were fortunate. It literally turned out that having ERGs was the embodiment of that old saying of when preparation meets opportunity. And organizations that happen to have ERGs were prepared to seize the opportunity of having this workforce that suddenly became distributed, being able to actually embrace it and maintain a culture around it. Whereas organizations that didn't have these groups, or had maybe the beginnings of these groups but not well developed, found themselves floundering a little bit and sort of hanging in there and hoping that things went back to normal, which P.S. I can tell you, there is no going back to any normal. We can only go forward. And the new normal is more disruptive, with more change coming faster and quicker than ever before. I like to say to people, this is sort of like a little take on, I think it's the Navy SEAL motto that your slowest day was yesterday, and tomorrow is not going to slow down. So if you're putting things off because tomorrow maybe you'll have time, you won't. You'll be busier tomorrow, and there'll be more disruption tomorrow than there was today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's this ability to be flexible and agile, and just kind of to roll with things, I think is one of those key skill sets that you don't know. the acceleration of change, the acceleration of literally everything. It's like, whoo, all right, well,
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a quick example of acceleration in terms of going from lab to live right away. In Japan, a little over a year ago, about 2 years ago, an experiment was done by this organization called Orly Labs. And literally what they did was they set up this coffee shop, and it had these long blonde wooden tables like the kind you see in Starbucks. And they invited various faculty and staff to come in and to have coffee and chat with the service staff. Except none of the service staff was physically in the building. Instead, what they had was on each table, there was a little half robot body attached to it that would take the orders. And then there were these little mobile robots that went back and picked up the order and brought it to the table and would chat and interact with the guests that were in this coffee shop. The majority of these robots were controlled by people who actually were bedridden and were basically bedridden disabled patients that were called pilots. And using VR goggles and computers and through Wi-Fi, they were interacting with people that were in this cafe. So the robot wasn't controlled by AI, it was controlled by human pilots. And these human pilots were able to interact with the guests that were in the coffee shop. In less than a year, 20 months later, an actual coffee shop opened up in the middle of Tokyo exactly that way, exactly with robots as the servers. And you have the robot on the table that takes the order, the robots that are mobile that bring people to their tables and that go and pick up the orders. And this is expected to mushroom and grow. But if you think about it, and the guy who the CEO of the company said that the idea was to open up opportunity for people that traditionally would have been considered unemployable in certain types of jobs, to let them also work in these jobs. But he's thinking beyond coffee. He's thinking beyond having these restaurants or shops. And if you think about it, warehouse work, some of the essential work that needed to be done during COVID, where there were challenges because of social distancing, you can literally have people who can then work from home and run these robots or cobots, as some people call them, who actually are physically there doing the lifting or doing the serving or whatever. Take that then to the next level and think about that. And you were talking before about the global economy and people working from overseas and the United States and vice versa. Well, now that opens the number of jobs that can be performed that way. That opens the number of things that can be done by people who do not have to physically be in the same place or within the same time frame. And how do organizations then create cultures that are able to, again, grow the tent to be able to also maintain that expanded workforce? And I think, again, ERGs, BRGs, perfectly positioned to be able to supply that culture raft and just expand that culture raft.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we talk about with everyday inclusion is it's not tech for tech's sake. Tech happens to
Right.
be a frictionless delivery model, right? That enables, right, enables reach, enables conversations, enables things to happen. And I like the examples that you were using because this isn't tech driven, it's not AI driven, it's actually people powered, right? So it's people
Yes.
powered tech, right? That is allowing for inclusion, that is allowing for, I love the idea of, right, get a bigger tent. So I think that when we're thinking about what it takes to lead these efforts, I think this role has evolved so quickly over the past 5 years. And then what it takes and the skills to lead DEI, to lead ERGs. What do you see that evolution and what do you see some of those core skills being, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that today, people who lead ERGs as well as people who lead DEI have to be futurists. I know a friend of mine who also has a podcast on the future of work, Jacob Morgan. I interviewed him on another program one time, and he has a book that talks about some of the things that leaders need to have in the future to be effective leaders. And one of the things that he talks about is that leaders, business leaders, need to be futurists. They need to start looking far ahead instead of just, what's immediately in front of them. And I think that's true for DEI leaders and ERG leaders. I think that today, a lot of ERG leaders and BRG leaders, as well as CDOs, find themselves really busy trying to figure out how to handle all types of situations that are coming at them very, very quickly. And in some cases, maybe trying to use the tools of the past. Well, let's see what my friend over here is doing, best practice, or what's this other group over here, and that's just not fast enough anymore. So the analogy that I like to use, I think I've shared it with you a couple of times before, is I like to use the analogy that the skills that a DEI and an ERG leader need today are very similar to what a major league baseball hitter needs to call to bear in order to be able to perform hitting the ball, right? When a pitcher throws a ball at a batter on home plate, there's about a distance of about 60 and a half, right? Feet between the two of them. And that ball traveling at 100 miles an hour closes that distance in about 375 seconds. So for your listeners who are trying to figure out mathematically what that means, one way to think about it is it's the speed at which we blink. Generally, our blink happens in about 375 milliseconds. So in 375 milliseconds, the ball is going to go from that glove over here into that area where the batter can reach it with the bat. And it takes like a big chunk of that time. It takes at least 200 of those milliseconds just for that, for that person, that batter that's standing there, to communicate to their brain, hands move and swing the bat. It's about 200, 250 milliseconds to do that. It takes another 100 milliseconds just to register the ball has left the pitcher's hand and is starting to travel in a certain direction. So, that leaves like 25 milliseconds to make the decision, because if you swing and it's out of the strike zone, that's a strike. And if you don't swing and it was within the strike zone, that also is a strike. So that decision has to happen within that period. And the way that these major league baseball players do it 30% of the time is that they have superior vision. A lot of them have like 20/12, 29. They have like really great visual acuity, stereoscopic visual acuity. So they can see the setup moves that the pitcher is making. And based on experience, they can determine somewhat what kind of ball is coming, if it's going to be a fastball, and where basically it's going to be going. And as a result of that, it gives them that edge, that little millisecond edge that they need to be able to prepare appropriately, and then via experience and a well-coordinated body to make the moves necessary to hit that home run that makes all of us stand up and cheer. Now, organizationally, for CDOs and ERG leaders, that means one, you've got to be looking for signals that are far out. If you're seeing, for example, AI is becoming a big player in the area of recruiting. Not only is AI being used to ferret through resumes and determine which ones are actually going to get an interview, but now AIs are being developed that can conduct the interview. They can videotape the interview and use things like facial expressions and so forth to determine who gets to the next cut, which is the final interview that goes into the hiring phase. AI can then determine how much to pay that person, all these different things. And these AIs all have different types of biases in them. It's been shown again and again. There are examples with the Amazon recruiting AI, and there are several others that we can cite. And right now, in a lot of organizations, the focus is on, well, let's do unconscious bias with the recruiters and the hiring managers. Well, shouldn't something be done with these AIs? Shouldn't DEI and ERGs be focusing on that part of the process that determines who actually even gets an interview and possibly even does the first round of interviews, right? So looking ahead and saying, okay, where is this going, and what is this leading to, and what are some of the things that we can do in order to address these new technologies. The other is setting up an organization that is structured in such a way that information moves through it very quickly, horizontally and vertically, sort of like that athletic body that's able to respond very quickly once it knows which way the ball is going, and then developing the muscle experience in terms of looking at these different signals and seeing the confluence of them, and how you've got the robotics now that we talked about, the cobots on one side, the AI on the other. Can you envision, as we were talking before we started recording this, can you envision a world where these come together, and what are some of the potential things that can happen, and how do you prepare to be able to avoid obstacles and pounce on opportunities? And really, what it comes down to is that we need to be sort of like there's an old saying, I think what the fellow's name was, Tom Robbins, not Tony Robbins, but Tom Robbins, a writer, who said that a truly stable system is one that expects the unexpected, is prepared to be disrupted, and waits to be transformed. So the key is stop looking back, or even so much at what's immediately in front of you, and develop skills and reading those signals, determining that direction, and then make sure that you've worked on your organization through the various components of whether you have your executive sponsor, your connection to your CEO, your connection to the different silos within the organization, so that you can communicate quickly and put these pieces together and come up with decisions that are timely. I think that those are the really new skills that ERG and DEI leaders need in order to succeed as we go forward.
Well, and then, thinking about the culture that you're both helping to co-create, but those cultures that are about sort of holding on to knowledge, or that are risk averse, or boy, they're in trouble, aren't they?
They're in big trouble. They're in big trouble. It's really interesting. There's another book that was written by Simon Sinek called The Infinity Game. I don't know how many of your listeners have read it, but one of the things that he talks about is cultures like the ones that you just described now. They're playing business and life as if it were a finite game, where the objective is, let's just, make the next quarter, or make the next year, and, show Wall Street, how, we're doing. Very short term, very like moment to moment to moment, very finite sort of targets. Whereas the businesses that really have been booming, the ones that, we look at with admiration, that are growing at incredible speeds, they're playing an infinite game. They're playing for the long-term vision of where they want to be, who they want to be, and they've got their eye on that prize. And they know that they, being the individuals who are now the players, will step off the stage, and other people will step on that stage. But if you want to have a concern that a going concern that addresses the issues and the needs of clients and the world at large, and continues to be profitable, we need to start thinking in a more infinite way. We need to start thinking of where we want to be, what role we want to play, what is our driving cause or mission as an organization beyond the quarter to quarter, eking out a couple of numbers. And how do we continuously build and rebuild ourselves? Because there's no such thing as, we're done and now we're the perfect organization and all we're going to do is take in raw materials, create a product, and put money in the bank. The world will continue changing, and organizations will continue to have a need to evolve, and so will ERGs and ERG leaders. It's continuous, exponential, and infinite change.
I use Moxie as an example of this. I say that we're on Moxie 4.0. We just keep pivoting, right? If we'd held to, well, this is what we do and this is how we do it, we would have been out of business in like year 3. right? And
Yes.
instead it was like, this is what we're trying to solve for. This is who we are and what we're doing in the world. We just keep pivoting. I feel like it's we're this sailboat, right? That just keeps tacking and we're getting to the, so
Yes.
right?
No,
Like,
yeah, I love your analogy, Mo, that you just used, because that's exactly what it is. And that's a skill too, because you cannot, you cannot in many cases control the cards that you're dealt. You can't control how your organization is going to use AI, or what new competitor is going to come in and what they're going to be doing, or if there's going to be another pandemic. You can't control any of that. But once you know directionally where you want to go as an organization, and whether you're, and this is whether you're an ERG community within the big organization or the larger organization of the DEI practice, what you can do is adjust your sails, right? You can adjust your sails so that you can at least directionally keep going toward that area that you set your sights on intentionally, to continue to provide that value, provide that service. That's what we control. And that's another skill that becomes really important. I call that in my book, I call it MacGyvering. You have to figure out how to make the best out of any situation that you've got, and not just sit there and say, well, let's just wait until things become better, because right now this is very confusing. So let's wait until things go back to normal and then we'll do something. It's never going to go back to normal. We have to switch our sails.
Yeah, and we don't want it to go back to normal, because normal didn't work for most people. Right?
That's right. That's right. Normal did not work for most people.
So you mentioned, I know that you've got a book coming out. Tell me about the book.
Yeah. The book is The New DEI and ERG Frontier: How You and Your Efforts Can Rise and Thrive in the World of Constant Disruption. And basically what the book does is it looks at the role of DEI leaders and ERG leaders, and how those roles have evolved from the beginning, way back in the 1960s, the 1970s, and Rochester and so forth, and how each one of the changes that have happened throughout that history have called for DEI leaders and ERG leaders to develop new skills and to bring new value to the table. And then what it does is, in sort of toward the middle, it looks at all of the different technologies and all of the different disruptions that are clearly already being signaled as coming in our direction. I touched on a few, like a workforce where there are less and less employees, more and more contractors. We're going to have more and more people in the different dimensions. I would say we're lucky if we keep 35% of the people that used to be, that white collar worker, same place, same office, same time as everybody else. That it'll be a miracle if even 35% of people are left there over the course of the next couple of years. At least a lot of the investors are betting that it's going to go the other way by creating more tools for the other dimensions. And so it looks at all these technologies. And then the next thing it looks at is, what are some of the things that CDOs can do, and what are some of the things that ERG leaders can do to prepare themselves and their organizations to be able to play like that major league player who can hit any ball that comes at them, right? So it doesn't fastball, slow ball, curve ball. You have to be prepared for it all. And part of it is you have to be able to anticipate what's coming, and you have to be physically and organizationally prepared to be able to communicate quickly so that you can act much faster than ever before. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what the book is about. It is actually up on Amazon right now for pre-order as a Kindle. The Kindle version. On April 11th, that's when the paper and the audio version will be published. And one more thing, Mo, real quick for your listeners. On my website, one of my websites, ergpowertalk.com. So ergpowertalk, one word, all lowercase.com. There's a link there to a self-assessment, which will let them see if are they ready for the future? And it's free. It's about 10 questions. probably knock it off in 2.5 to 3 minutes, but it'll give them a little report that says, what areas they're strong in and what areas perhaps they need to start looking at in order to strengthen either themselves or their organization to be able to succeed and thrive in the future.
Love that. Love that. And can't wait. So
Now,
I can pre-order now, or it'll be on Amazon April 11th. I want you to leave me with one last truth bomb, Joe.
Truth bomb. Well, I think that one of the things that, and we talked about this before, and I wrote nothing down because I figured inspiration would come, and now I'm waiting for my muse to yell at me. But, but I think that one of the things that we're going to find that's going to become really important to organizations is this whole AI. This whole AI thing. I did a survey a year ago, back in 2021, early part of 2021, where one of the questions that I asked HR leaders was, do you think that the use of AI in recruiting, hiring, and so forth will, one, increase inclusion, equity, and diversity, two, decrease inclusion, equity, and diversity, or, three, it depends. It depends on certain things that we do. To my surprise, about 63% said, oh, it'll automatically increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, under the belief that, well, it's a machine, it's scientific, it doesn't have any human biases. Now, you're nodding your head, I know, because you know, as I do, having interviewed so many data scientists, that nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that these machines are loaded with the biases of the people who built them. They're loaded with the biases of our historic data, which is loaded with even more biases based on some of the practices of the past. But what I thought was really shocking about that answer is that we now know that the AI gods are flawed, but we also know that the people that are engaging them are unaware of it. The biggest trick the devil ever pulled on mankind was convincing them that there was no devil, right? So in many cases, organizations are buying these tools, and they're not buying them they're buying them the way we used to buy PCs, like back in the 1995 or whatever, where little departments would buy their PC. Now you've got somebody in HR buying this AI tool or engaging without really a whole look at the exposure. And I think, and this is the part that I think is really going to have, I guess, a little bit of a punch for some organizations. I think that some CEOs and management teams are going to discover something, that they actually have a tremendous amount of exposure in terms of these tools and their biases that a lot of their leaders or people leaders aren't aware of. Because once somebody says, hey, you know what? I didn't get that job, or I was discriminated against in terms of my salary or in terms of getting hired by this company, then the company's going to turn around and say, well, it wasn't me, it was the AI. And the vendor's going to turn around and say, well, I just built the vessel, but it's your data that it used to determine your practices. And the lawyers are going to have a field day. unless DEI and ERGs get ahead of it now, and the companies get ahead of it now.
Perfect. I love that as an endpoint, because at the center of all of us are human beings. Yes. Machines can't take this over. And if we allow the machines to take over without thoughtful, right? The AI, I think it's already, right? We're already seeing the negative ripple effects of AI as it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I love that sort of both. I love the whole tone of this, Joe, in terms of future focus, right? Being nimble, being ready to adjust, right? Being able to read. And then the cautionary, there is no silver bullet, right? And if you're looking at AI as your silver bullet, troubles are coming.
Oh yeah. Big troubles are coming. Especially organizations will say, well, we don't put in the gender information, or we don't put in anything that's socially descriptive. It is amazing how these AIs will figure out, because there have been experiments that have been done where they literally, without I mean, the most smallest little piece of information that they pick up from massive amounts of data, and they start selecting out all the women for leadership positions and focusing on the men for leadership positions, even though the AI has been blinded by the people who are programming it
Yep.
to the gender of the resumes coming in. So it's going to be a big issue. It's going to be a growing issue. I think we can get in front of it, or we can wait until the lawsuits roll in and then start addressing it. It's a choice, right?
Joe, can't wait to read the book. Really, really appreciate you joining me for this conversation, but just what you've done for so many years and the community that you've built around this, the tools that you've brought. Thank you. Keep up the great work. We always say here, do the next right thing, and keep doing the next right thing, Joe.
Thank you so much, Mo. It's been a pleasure being here with you today.
Bye, y'all, and we will see you next week on Everyday Inclusion and Belonging. Get out there and do the next right thing. Cheers.